My younger sister handed me a brochure and a check for 5 grand asking me to terminate my miracle pregnancy as a wedding gift. She looked me in the eye and said a pregnant bridesmaid would ruin her aesthetic, adding I could always buy another round of treatments later. She thought she was eliminating a minor inconvenience to secure her perfect life. She had no idea handing me that paper would be the catalyst to destroy her fake world and strip away every dollar our family ever had. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. I am a forensic accountant tracking down hidden assets and exposing financial fraud. I am used to dealing with liars, but I never expected to find the most ruthless ones at my own family dinner table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to a toxic family member who treated you like a disposable object. Trust me, the way I took them down is something you will want to hear. The air inside the VIP fitting room of the elite Manhattan bridal boutique smelled heavily of expensive gardenias and suffocating entitlement. I sat on a velvet-tufted sofa resting my hands over my rounding stomach. I was 12 weeks pregnant. This baby was the result of 3 grueling years of in vitro fertilization, countless hormone injections and silent tears my husband Daniel and I had shared behind closed doors. Brittany, my 26-year-old sister, stood on the pedestal in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was draped in custom-imported silk, adjusting a veil that cost more than my first car. She was the golden child, a lifestyle influencer whose existence revolved around curated social media feeds. She recently hooked Devin, an affluent orthopedic surgeon from a prestigious family in Atlanta. Brittany stepped off the pedestal, her heavy silk train dragging across the plush white carpet. She walked over to her designer handbag, pulled out a thick envelope, and dropped it onto my lap. Inside was a sleek brochure for an exclusive private clinic on the Upper East Side. Tucked behind it was a cashier's check made out to me for 5 grand. I stared at the numbers, my brain trying to process the sheer audacity. I looked up at Brittany. She was busy checking her side profile in the mirror. "You need to book the appointment by Friday," she said, her tone as casual as if she were asking me to pick up dry cleaning. "I am not having a maternity dress in my bridal party, Natalie. It will completely ruin the aesthetic I am going for. Plus, the photos will look ridiculous with you standing next to me looking bloated." I sat perfectly still. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the air. She knew exactly what I had gone through to get pregnant. She knew about the failed cycles, the heartbreak, the endless medical bills. "Just take the 5 grand, Brittany continued, turning to face me with an exasperated sigh. "Use it to get the procedure done quietly. Devin's family is very traditional, and I cannot have them distracted by your drama. You and Daniel make decent money. You can always pay for another round of IVF next year. This is my only big day in life, Natalie. Do not be selfish." A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The hurt I usually felt around my family vanished, replaced by a calculating stillness. I picked up the check, holding it up to the flattering chandelier light. I smiled, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You want to talk about paying for things, Brittany? I paid for my own IVF treatments for 3 years out of my pocket. I paid for them because our parents abruptly cut off my college fund during my senior year, claiming the business was struggling and they needed cash. 2 weeks later, they magically found $80,000 to buy you a brand new Porsche just because you cried about taking the bus." Her jaw tightened, the smug expression faltering for just a second. "That is completely different, and you know it," she snapped, her voice rising an octave. "You are just jealous because Devin is giving me the life you always wanted. Are you going to take the check and fix this problem? Or do I need to call Mom?" I leaned forward, sliding the check back across the glass coffee table until it stopped right at her feet. "Call her," I whispered. "But neither of you have enough money to buy my child, and you will soon realize I am no longer playing by your rules." The heavy velvet curtain separating our private suite from the main showroom was violently yanked aside before the last word even left my mouth. My mother Beatrice stood in the entryway, She was holding a crystal flute of complimentary champagne, her knuckles white from gripping the stem so tightly. She wore a tailored tweed suit that screamed old money, though I knew for a fact it was purchased on a credit card carrying a 29% interest rate. She must have been standing right outside listening to the entire exchange, or perhaps Brittany had secretly texted her from her Apple Watch. "What on earth is going on in here?" Beatrice demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Before I could even open my mouth to explain, Brittany deployed her greatest weapon, the tears. They fell instantly, perfectly rolling down her cheeks without ruining her expensive makeup. "Mom, Natalie is trying to sabotage my wedding," Brittany sobbed, clutching the silk bodice of her gown. "She refuses to take care of her little problem. She is being completely unreasonable and selfish, just like she always is." Beatrice did not ask for my side of the story. She never did. She marched across the plush white carpet, her designer heels sinking into the fabric with heavy, purposeful steps. Without a single word of hesitation, without even a flicker of maternal hesitation, she raised her free hand and slapped me across the left cheek. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the high ceilings of the boutique. It was so loud that the two bridal attendants who had been quietly organizing veils in the corner audibly gasped and dropped the delicate fabrics to the floor. They stood frozen in pure shock, their eyes darting between us. I did not fall. I did not cry. I did not even raise my hand to touch my stinging face. I simply turned my head back to look at my mother. "How dare you speak to your sister with such disrespect?" Beatrice hissed, stepping so close I could smell the gin beneath her expensive perfume. "You have always been a bitter, jealous girl. You could not stand the fact that Brittany is the one marrying into true high society. You had to find a way to make this entirely about yourself." She took a breath, her chest heaving as she launched into the gaslighting that had defined my entire childhood. "Do not think I do not see exactly what you are doing, Natalie," she sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You deliberately timed this pregnancy. You planned your little medical procedures to coincide exactly with her engagement just so you could steal her spotlight. You cannot stand that Brittany is securing $1 million union with Devon's family while you are just a miserable number cruncher married to a government worker. Devon's parents are elite in Atlanta. They are respected, traditional, and flawless. We are not going to let your bloated ego and your petty jealousy embarrass this family at the altar." The sheer delusion in her words was almost clinical. She was accusing me of going through 3 years of agonizing fertility treatments, hundreds of painful injections, and endless heartbreak, all just to upstage a wedding that had only been planned 6 months ago. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on detaching emotion from facts. I looked at her, and I did not see a mother defending her daughter. I saw a desperate woman terrified of losing her only ticket to wealth and social status. I saw a fraud. I slowly reached down and picked up the cashier's check that was still resting by Brittany's bare feet. "You actually think this is about jealousy, Mother?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. I held the crisp piece of paper up between us. I took the top edge and tore it deliberately down the middle. Beatrice gasped, her eyes widening in horror as I tore the $5,000 again. And again. I shredded the paper into tiny, worthless pieces until it was nothing but confetti in my palm. I took one step forward, forcing my mother to take a step back. I held my hand over her crystal champagne flute and opened my fingers. The shredded pieces of the check fluttered down, landing in her drink, and turning the expensive champagne into a soggy, floating mess of ruined paper. "Keep your money, Beatrice," I said, making sure to use her first name. "You are going to need every single cent of it very soon." I turned around, grabbed my coat and my leather handbag from the velvet chair, and walked straight toward the exit. I did not look back at Brittany, who was standing completely silent on her pedestal. I walked right past the two terrified bridal attendants, offering them a polite, tight-lipped smile, as I pushed through the velvet curtains and out the front doors of the boutique, stepping into the cold, crisp Manhattan air. The cold Manhattan wind hit my face the moment I stepped out of the boutique, but it did nothing to cool the quiet fury burning inside my chest. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket to order a ride home. Before I could even open the app, the screen lit up with a rapid succession of incoming text messages. The notifications fired off one after another, vibrating violently against my palm. They were all from my father, Richard. I stood on the edge of the busy sidewalk, watching the messages flood my screen. Your mother just called me in tears. What is wrong with you? You ruined your sister's fitting. You physically assaulted your mother and threw a drink on her. You are completely unhinged and out of control. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to apologize to both of them. You will do exactly what your sister asked you to do, or you can consider yourself dead to this family. If you refuse, I am calling the management office at your building first thing tomorrow morning. I will pull my name off your lease as guarantor and have you evicted by the end of the week. I will not subsidize the lifestyle of a jealous, ungrateful child. Do not test me, Natalie. I read the messages twice. A genuine chilling smile spread across my face. The sheer arrogance of the man was almost comical, but his profound ignorance was what truly amused me. Richard genuinely believed he still held the keys to my life. 5 years ago, when I first moved into my luxury high-rise, my credit was still recovering from the heavy student loans I took on after they cut my college fund. Richard had co-signed my original lease. He loved doing it because it gave him a permanent sense of control, a trump card he could threaten to play whenever I stepped out of line. What my father conveniently forgot or simply never bothered to notice because he was entirely consumed with funding. Brittany's lavish lifestyle was that I was a highly successful forensic accountant. My husband Daniel and I had not been renting for a very long time. We bought the entire penthouse outright 3 years ago. We wiped Richard's name from every single piece of financial documentation the second the ink was dry on the deed. He had absolutely zero legal standing to evict me from a property I owned free and clear. But his threat gave me a wonderful idea. It reminded me of a piece of leverage I actually held over him. Instead of typing out an angry reply to my father, I closed the message thread and dialed a different number. I called the managing director of my private real estate portfolio. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good afternoon, Natalie," my property manager, Gregory, said. "How can I help you today?" "Hello, Gregory," I replied, keeping my voice steady over the blaring horns of passing yellow cabs. "I need you to pull up the master file for the commercial property on West 44th Street, specifically the 5th floor suite currently leased to Richard's real estate firm." "Of course," Gregory said. I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard on his end of the line. "I have it right here. They leased the space under a corporate contract. I had purchased that commercial building 2 years ago through a blind holding company. I bought it purely as an investment when the previous landlord filed for bankruptcy." Richard and Beatrice had absolutely no idea that their estranged scapegoat daughter was the mysterious corporate landlord they had been writing rent checks to for the past 24 months. "Tell me, Gregory," I said, watching a black car pull up to the curb in front of me. "What is their current payment status?" Gregory sighed, the sound of a man who dealt with difficult tenants all day. "They are severely delinquent, Natalie. They have bounced their last 3 rent checks, and the accounting department has been giving them grace periods because they promised a large commission was coming through. They are currently 90 days past due." "Perfect," I whispered, opening the door to my ride and sliding into the quiet leather interior. "I want you to draft a formal 30-day eviction notice," I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "Print it out and have it delivered by a registered courier directly to my father's reception desk first thing tomorrow morning. I want it handed to him personally. No more grace periods, no extensions." "Are you absolutely sure?" Gregory asked. "Commercial evictions can get quite messy." "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "Serve them the notice, Gregory." I ended the call and leaned back against the headrest as the car merged into the heavy city traffic. Richard wanted to play games with housing and leverage. He wanted to threaten me with homelessness, to force me into giving up my unborn child. He was about to learn a very brutal lesson about what real power looked like. The war had officially started, and my family had just foolishly handed me the launch codes. The black car pulled up to my building. I walked through the marble lobby, greeting the concierge, feeling an odd sense of calm. The elevator ride to the penthouse was quiet. When I stepped inside, the panoramic view of the city skyline usually relaxed me, but today my mind was running complex risk assessments. The war had started, and I needed to anticipate their next move. My phone began to ring, shattering the silence of the apartment. The caller ID flashed Brittany's name. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and answered on the fourth ring. "Natalie, please." Brittany sobbed loudly into the receiver. The shift in her tone gave me emotional whiplash. The arrogant, demanding bride from the fitting room was gone, replaced by a trembling, fragile victim. Her acting skills had always been her greatest asset. "Why are you doing this to me? I am under so much stress with the wedding. My hair is falling out from anxiety. Devin is working crazy surgical shifts at the hospital, and I hardly see him. I just wanted my big sister to support me, and instead you attack Mom and ruin my fitting. How could you be so cruel?" I took a slow sip of my water, letting her theatrical performance play out. I could almost hear Beatrice coaching her in the background. "You handed me a brochure to terminate my child, Brittany," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not insult my intelligence by crying." I hit the red button to end the call before she could squeeze out another fake tear or pivot to blaming me again. I placed the phone face down on the cold granite counter. 10 seconds later, the phone buzzed. I flipped it over. The victim act had evaporated as quickly as it appeared, replaced by raw defensive venom. The text read, "Do not bother coming to the rehearsal dinner tonight. Devin's family already knows exactly what kind of woman you are. Save yourself the embarrassment and stay home." I stared at the glowing screen. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to look for patterns in erratic behavior. People who commit fraud always panic when they lose control of the narrative. The text was not a warning, it was a barricade. She had launched a preemptive smear campaign. She needed to control the story before I could expose her true character to Devin's affluent, dignified parents. If I stayed home, I would look guilty of whatever heinous lies she had just fed them. By telling me not to come, she was proving she was terrified that my mere presence would dismantle her carefully constructed illusion. I walked straight into my walk-in closet. I was not going to hide in my apartment like a banished pariah. I was going to walk into that restaurant and let them look me directly in the eye. I bypassed the loose flowing dresses I usually wore to conceal my growing bump from my judgmental mother. Instead, I pulled out a tailored emerald green maternity sheath dress. It was elegant, undeniably expensive, and hugged my 12-week curve perfectly. It was the exact opposite of the bloated, shameful image Brittany wanted me to project. I paired it with my classic nude heels and a simple diamond tennis bracelet Daniel had given me for our anniversary. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, polished chignon. I looked exactly like what I was. A successful, independent woman who could not be intimidated. I walked out to the living room just as Daniel emerged from his home office, rubbing his tired eyes. He was deep into prepping a massive federal indictment and looked exhausted. "You look incredible," he said, pausing to admire my outfit. "Are we going somewhere?" "I am going to the rehearsal dinner," I said, adjusting my watch. "Brittany just informed me that Devin's family has been told exactly what kind of woman I am. I figure it is only polite to introduce them to the real thing." Daniel smirked. He knew my family dynamics better than anyone, and he knew exactly what that cold, calculated look in my eye meant. "Do you need backup?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "No," I replied, grabbing my leather clutch. "You need to finish your case. Besides, they are not worth the time of an assistant United States attorney. This is just a preliminary audit. I am just going to collect data and observe their behavior." I took the elevator down to the garage and got into my car. The drive to the exclusive restaurant took 20 minutes. I handed my keys to the valet, smoothed down the front of my emerald dress, and walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the establishment. I was ready to face the firing squad, fully armed with the one thing my family never possessed: the truth. The maitre d' escorted me down a dimly lit hallway paneled in dark oak. We reached the private dining room at the back of the restaurant. I paused for a fraction of a second, just outside the arched entryway, taking a steadying breath before stepping into the lion's den. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over a long mahogany table set with heavy silver and delicate porcelain. At the far end of the table sat Devon's family. They were a portrait of dignified generational success. Devon's father, a retired chief of surgery, sat tall in a tailored charcoal suit. Next to him was Gloria, Devon's mother. She radiated an intimidating quiet elegance in a structured plum dress, her posture perfectly straight. Right beside Gloria sat Brittany, and the sight of her almost made me laugh out loud. The girl who had just hours ago been screaming at me in a bridal boutique was currently slouched in her chair, pressing a silk napkin to her chest and breathing in shallow, dramatic gasps. She was putting on a theatrical award-winning performance of severe morning sickness. "Oh, my poor dear," Gloria was saying, her voice laced with genuine maternal concern as she gently rubbed Brittany's back. "The first trimester is always the hardest. Let the waiter bring you some ginger ale and plain crackers. Devon, make sure she stays hydrated." Devon nodded, looking stressed but deeply devoted as he poured her another glass of water. It was a perfectly executed manipulation. Brittany was weaponizing a fake pregnancy to guarantee unconditional sympathy and loyalty from her future wealthy in-laws. I took a step forward, my emerald green heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was subtle, but in that quiet, intimate room it was enough to draw attention. Brittany looked up first. The fragile, sickly victim act vanished from her eyes for a split second, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. Her sudden, rigid posture made Beatrice turn her head. When my mother saw me standing there in my tailored maternity dress, looking confident and completely unbothered, all the color drained from her face. The clinking of silverware abruptly stopped. The quiet hum of polite conversation died instantly. The room went dead silent. Beatrice and Richard reacted purely on instinct. They both abruptly shoved their chairs back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. They stood up in unison and rushed toward me before I could even reach the edge of the table. They positioned their bodies like bouncers, physically blocking my path to the rest of the guests. "What are you doing here?" Richard hissed under his breath. Stepping so close his expensive cologne was suffocating. "I told you not to come. Turn around and walk out right now before I make a scene. You have absolutely no right to show your face after what you did today," Beatrice whispered frantically, her manicured fingers gripping my upper arm like a vice. "You are not going to ruin this night for your sister. Get out." I looked down at my mother's hand digging into my arm and then looked her dead in the eye. "Let go of me, Beatrice," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laced with enough ice to make her flinch and drop her hand. I was fully prepared to walk around them, but I did not have to. "Is everything all right over there?" a deep, commanding voice called out. It was Devon. He had stood up from his seat, a confused frown on his handsome face. He possessed the impeccable manners of a Southern gentleman, and watching his future in-laws aggressively corner a pregnant woman at the entrance of a dinner party clearly disturbed him. "Everything is fine, Devon," Richard said quickly, forcing a loud, booming laugh that sounded completely unnatural. "Natalie was just leaving. She is not feeling well. Pregnancy fatigue, you know how it is." "Actually, I feel fantastic," I said, projecting my voice clearly across the room so Devon's parents could hear every word. "I would not miss this dinner for the world." Brittany looked like she was about to pass out for real. Devon immediately stepped out from behind the table and walked over to us. He completely ignored Richard's frantic signals. "Natalie, it is so good to see you," Devon said warmly, leaning in to give me a gentle hug. "Brittany mentioned you might not make it because of some family tension, but I am so glad you decided to come. Please come sit down. There is a seat right next to my mother." Devin extended his arm, offering to escort me. I smiled sweetly, sliding my hand into the crook of his elbow. I could practically feel the heat radiating from Richard and Beatrice, as they were forced to step aside and watch the man they were trying to con treat me with the utmost respect. "Thank you, Devin," I said loudly. "I have been looking forward to properly meeting your parents all evening." I let him guide me toward the table. As I took my seat next to Gloria, I caught Brittany's eye. She was gripping her glass of water so tightly, her knuckles were white. Gloria observed me as I settled into my chair. Her intelligent dark eyes scanned my face and then dropped to the emerald fabric resting over my stomach. She offered a polite but incredibly measured smile. It was the look of a matriarch who had already been fed a poisonous narrative and was currently deciding whether or not I was the villain she had been warned about. The true battle was about to begin, and I had just secured the best seat in the house. The first course arrived shortly after I took my seat. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently around the mahogany table, placing delicate plates of seared scallops and lump crab tartare in front of each guest. The atmosphere was thick, with a suffocating, unspoken tension. Devin's father raised his crystal glass to propose a warm, heartfelt toast to the happy couple and the merging of two wonderful families. I raised my glass of sparkling water and smiled gracefully, while catching Richard glaring daggers at me from the opposite end of the table. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Beside me, Brittany was barely touching her food. She kept her eyes glued to her plate, occasionally letting out a soft, dramatic sigh to remind everyone of her imaginary nausea. Gloria, however, was a masterclass in high society composure. She engaged me in polite, measured small talk as we ate. She asked about my career, her tone deceptively casual. I told her about my work as a forensic accountant, explaining how I specialized in tracking hidden assets and uncovering corporate fraud. I answered her questions with calm precision and articulate confidence. I watched a flicker of genuine surprise register in Gloria's dark eyes. I clearly did not sound or behave like the erratic, unhinged woman she had been led to expect. As the waiters efficiently cleared the appetizer plates to make way for the main course, Gloria gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with her linen napkin and placed it neatly beside her plate. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Natalie, would you be so kind as to accompany me to the powder room?" she asked softly. It was perfectly polite, but we both knew it was not a request. It was a summons. I offered a warm nod, excused myself, and stood up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Beatrice grip the edge of the table, her face draining of color. Richard looked like he was about to intervene, but stopping the mother of the groom from going to the restroom would have been an unexplainable breach of etiquette. They were trapped, forced to sit there and watch us walk away, knowing exactly what was about to happen. I led Gloria down the dimly lit, oak-paneled hallway. We entered the ladies' lounge, a lavish expanse of imported marble floor-to-ceiling mirrors and gold fixtures. We were completely alone. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us instantly, cutting off the ambient noise of the restaurant. The moment the latch engaged, the warm maternal smile Gloria had worn at the table vanished completely. It was replaced by the formidable, icy gaze of a fiercely protective matriarch. She did not raise her voice, but the sudden shift in her demeanor commanded absolute authority. "Natalie, I am a very direct woman, so I will get straight to the point," Gloria said, turning to face me fully. "I have spent the last 3 days listening to your mother and your sister cry over the immense stress you are causing them. I am told your presence here tonight is a calculated act of malice." I stood perfectly still, letting her speak. I needed to hear exactly what narrative Brittany had spun. Gloria took a step closer, her voice dropping into a cold, disappointed register. "Brittany confided in me about your unfortunate situation. She told me that your pregnancy is the result of a long-standing affair with a married senior partner at your accounting firm. She said you intentionally got pregnant to trap this wealthy man, and when he flatly refused to leave his wife and family. For you became incredibly bitter and vindictive. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Brittany had taken the very real, painful struggle of my IVF journey and twisted it into a cheap, scandalous soap opera. She had weaponized my successful career to make the lie sound plausible. According to your sister Gloria continued, her eyes locked onto mine, you are determined to ruin this wedding because you cannot stand seeing her secure a respectable, loving marriage while you are embroiled in a shameful public scandal. You have no real family of your own to lean on, so you are trying to tear hers apart out of pure spite. I kept my expression entirely neutral, absorbing the heavy accusations without flinching. Our family values integrity and character above all else, Gloria said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Devin is a prominent surgeon. His reputation is spotless, and our family name carries significant weight in Atlanta. We absolutely cannot have a scandal like this attached to his wedding. We will not be dragged into your mess. For the sake of your sister, and more importantly for the sake of my son, I am asking you to step down as a bridesmaid immediately. I want you to quietly excuse yourself from this dinner and stay away from the wedding tomorrow. Gloria stood tall, waiting for me to break down, confess, or run away, crying. She had delivered her ultimatum completely unaware that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle my sister's fake world. I did not gasp. I did not fall apart or rush to frantically defend my honor. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the loudest person in the room was usually the guilty one. I simply looked at Gloria, acknowledging the heavy burden she thought she was carrying to protect her son. It was almost sad how easily my sister had manipulated this incredibly smart woman. I slowly unclasped my leather clutch and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, tapped into my secure personal files, and handed the device directly to Gloria. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her brow furrowing in confusion, before accepting the phone. On the screen was a high-resolution scan of a legal document issued by the state of New York. "That is my marriage certificate, Gloria," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "I have been legally married for 4 years. The man I am supposedly having a scandalous affair with is my husband Daniel. He is 35 years old, and he is certainly not a senior partner at my accounting firm." Gloria stared at the screen. Her eyes darted across the official seals, the dates, and the signatures. I swiped the screen to the left, bringing up a photo gallery. There was a picture of Daniel and me on our wedding day, followed by a recent photo of us at a charity gala. Daniel looked sharp in his tuxedo, projecting an undeniable aura of authority and integrity. "Daniel is an assistant United States attorney," I explained, watching Gloria's expression begin to fracture. "He is a federal prosecutor. The only reason he is not sitting next to me at that dining table tonight is because he is currently at his office preparing a massive federal indictment for a racketeering case. He sends his deepest apologies for missing the rehearsal dinner, but federal judges are not particularly forgiving with strict legal deadlines." The silence in the luxurious powder room became absolute. I watched the cognitive dissonance wash over Gloria's face. She was a highly educated, discerning woman. She was mentally replaying the tearful, dramatic confession Brittany had given her, comparing it against the ironclad, undeniable proof resting in the palm of her hand. The realization hit her like a physical blow. My sister is an exceptional storyteller. I continued, keeping my tone entirely conversational. She knew I was coming tonight, and she knew I would not play along with whatever narrative my parents have constructed to secure this marriage. So she preemptively created a scandal so vile, so offensive to your family values, that you would demand I leave before I ever had the chance to speak to you. Gloria slowly lowered the phone. The icy, protective glare she had directed at me just moments ago was completely gone. In its place was a look of profound shock, quickly hardening into a quiet, terrifying anger. It was not directed at me. It was directed at the woman currently sitting next to her son in the dining room. She looked me in the eye and cried. Gloria whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "She sat in my living room, drank my tea, and wept over how deeply your actions were hurting the family. She told me you were a homewrecker. People who are lying usually cry the hardest." "Gloria," I replied gently, "it is a distraction tactic. They rely on your empathy to override your logic. I am not asking you to take my word for anything. I am an accountant. I deal strictly in documentation and facts. The fact is, I am a happily married woman carrying my husband's child, and your future daughter-in-law just fabricated a malicious, calculated lie to remove me from this room. I let those words hang in the air. The seed of distrust had not just been planted. It had been driven deep into the soil. If Brittany was capable of lying so easily, so convincingly about her own sister's pregnancy, what else was she lying about? I could see the exact moment that very question crossed Gloria's mind. Her eyes widened slightly, her posture stiffening as the implications began to ripple outward. Gloria handed my phone back to me. Her hands were perfectly steady, but the energy radiating from her had shifted completely. She was no longer a mother trying to manage a minor family squabble. She was a matriarch who had just realized there was a predator in her home. I apologize for the accusation, Natalie. Gloria said, her tone entirely different now. It was respectful, cautious, and incredibly serious. I was given completely false information. You were manipulated, I corrected her. And I do not blame you for trying to protect Devon. He seems like a genuinely good man. He deserves the truth. I smoothed down the front of my emerald dress and picked up my clutch. Shall we return to the table? I believe the main course is about to be served, and I would hate to keep my family waiting. Gloria and I walked out of the opulent powder room side by side. The shift in the power dynamic was palpable. When we re-entered the private dining room, the suffocating tension from earlier seemed to have magnified tenfold for my family. The main course had just been served, the plates of roasted lamb and truffle risotto steaming in the dim light. Richard and Beatrice were practically vibrating with anxiety. They were expecting Gloria to return alone, or perhaps for me to run out of the restaurant in tears. Instead, we walked in together, our heads held high. Gloria did not even look at my mother. She glided back to her seat next to her husband with a terrifyingly calm expression. I made my way back to my own chair, taking a slightly wider path around the table. As I approached my seat, I had to squeeze past the back of Brittany's chair. She had carelessly dumped her massive, oversized designer tote on the empty chair beside her. The heavy leather bag had tipped over onto its side, the gold clasp undone. Some of its contents had spilled out onto the dark upholstery. A compact mirror, a tube of expensive lipstick, and a glossy piece of black and white thermal paper. I glanced down casually, intending to just walk past, but my eyes locked onto the paper. It was an ultrasound photo. As a forensic accountant, my brain is hardwired to process visual data and pattern recognition in fractions of a second. I stopped walking. Something was fundamentally wrong with the image. I stared at the shape of the gestational sac printed on the glossy paper. It was distinct, slightly asymmetrical on the left side. But what made my blood run cold was the tiny faded smudge in the top right corner of the black background. It was a printer defect. I knew it was a printer defect because I had spent hours staring at that exact same smudge on the 8-week ultrasound scan currently pinned to my refrigerator at home. My mind raced, cross-referencing the details. The angle of the scan, the granular static near the bottom edge, the precise measurements logged in the tiny text on the side. It was not just similar. It was identical. It was my scan, my private medical record from a month ago. How did she get it? I suddenly remembered posting a heavily cropped version of it to a private family group chat right after my appointment, before I realized how toxic they truly were. I had cropped out my name, but the image itself was entirely intact. Brittany had not just lied about me having an affair. She was actively using my unborn child's medical imaging to fake her own pregnancy to Devon and his family. The sheer depravity of the act was staggering even for her. I needed proof. Without a second thought, I palmed my phone, which was still in my hand from my conversation with Gloria. I made a show of stumbling slightly on the thick carpet, pretending to lose my balance. I dropped my leather clutch onto the floor right next to Brittany's chair. "Oh, excuse me," I murmured, bending down to retrieve it. As I crouched, my phone hovered just inches above the spilled contents of her purse. I tapped the screen, relying on the quiet setting to mask the camera shutter. I snapped 3 high-resolution photos of the ultrasound picture, making sure the lighting caught the details perfectly. The camera captured the image along with the edge of her designer bag, tying the evidence directly to her. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and grabbed my clutch from the floor. Just as I stood up, Brittany turned around. Her eyes darted from me to her tipped-over bag. Absolute panic flashed across her face. She lunged forward, practically climbing over her own chair, and snatched the ultrasound photo off the seat. She shoved it deep into her bag and snapped the gold clasp shut with a loud, aggressive click. "What are you doing snooping around my things?" she hissed under her breath. Her eyes narrowed into venomous slits. I smoothed out my emerald dress and looked down at her. Her face was flushed red with a mix of anger and terror. She was grasping the handles of her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. "I was just picking up my clutch, Brittany," I said calmly, taking my seat next to her. "You really should be more careful with your belongings. You never know what might spill out for the world to see." She glared at me, her chest heaving, but she could not say another word without drawing attention from Devon's parents. I picked up my fork and took a bite of my dinner. The food tasted absolutely incredible. The war was far from over, but I now possessed the nuclear launch codes safely stored in the digital camera roll of my phone. The rest of the rehearsal dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and tense silence. I ate my truffle risotto, offered my polite congratulations during the toasts, and left the restaurant the moment dessert was cleared. The drive back to the penthouse was completely quiet. My mind was already leagues ahead, calculating variables and processing the sheer magnitude of what I had just discovered. When I walked through the front door of my apartment, I did not bother changing out of my emerald dress. I walked straight past the bedroom and down the hall into my home office. This room was my sanctuary. It was equipped with 3 high-resolution monitors, encrypted hard drives, and enterprise-grade forensic software. My day job consisted of tearing apart manipulated balance sheets, detecting forged signatures on corporate contracts, and finding money that billionaires desperately wanted to keep hidden. Exposing a 26-year-old lifestyle influencer was going to be child's play. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair, woke up my workstation, and connected my phone to the secure server. I transferred the 3 photographs I had covertly snapped of the ultrasound in Brittany's purse. I opened them in my forensic imaging suite, a program primarily designed to detect pixel manipulation and digital tampering in financial documents. Next, I logged into my private hospital patient portal and downloaded the original digital file of my own 8-week ultrasound scan. I dragged both images onto the center monitor, placing them side by side. At first glance, to the untrained eye, they were just 2 grainy black and white medical images. But I did not have an untrained eye. I began the process of digital verification. First, I cropped the edges of Brittany's photo, isolating just the ultrasound screen itself. Then I overlaid my original hospital file directly on top of hers. I set the top layer to 50% opacity and slowly dragged it into alignment. My breath caught in my throat. It was not just a similarity. It was an absolute, undisputed 100% match. Every single detail aligned perfectly. The slightly asymmetrical shape of the gestational sac, the granular static pattern near the bottom left quadrant, and there, sitting in the exact same coordinate on the top right corner, was the faded smudge from the hospital's defective printer. It was mathematically impossible for 2 different women to produce an identical sonogram, down to the microscopic pixel grain. I turned the opacity back to 100% and zoomed in on the top margin of Brittany's photo. This was where the patient data was printed. My name, Natalie, and my medical identification number had been completely wiped out. In its place, typed in a crisp, slightly misaligned Arial font that did not match the hospital's dot matrix system, was the name Brittany. She had literally photoshopped her own name over my medical records. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens in the dark room. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped into place, revealing a picture much darker than a simple case of sibling rivalry. Brittany was not pregnant. The dramatic nausea at the dinner table, the rubbing of her flat stomach, the absolute refusal to drink champagne. It was all a meticulously choreographed performance. She was faking an entire pregnancy to trap Devon. She knew that a man with his traditional family values and impeccable moral compass would never abandon a woman carrying his child. She was using a fabricated baby to secure her place in high society and lock down a wealthy surgeon. But the realization brought a wave of chilling questions. If she was faking a pregnancy, why was she so desperate for me to terminate mine? Why had our parents gone to such extreme aggressive lengths to force me out of the wedding and demand I get rid of my baby? A fake pregnancy would eventually be discovered unless she planned to stage a tragic miscarriage right after the wedding. But my real pregnancy was somehow a direct threat to her entire scheme. There was a financial motive here, a massive one, and I could smell it like blood in the water. The door to my office pushed open quietly. Daniel stood in the doorway wearing his sweatpants and a plain gray t-shirt, holding 2 mugs of tea. He took one look at my face illuminated by the monitors and immediately knew something monumental had just happened. He walked over, setting the mugs on the desk, and looked at the dual screens. As a federal prosecutor, it only took him 5 seconds to process the side-by-side images and the glaring font discrepancy on the forged document. "Is that what I think it is?" Daniel asked, his voice low and dead serious. I nodded, keeping my eyes locked on the forged name. "My sister is completely faking her pregnancy, Daniel. She stole my medical file to convince Devon to marry her." Daniel crossed his arms, his prosecutorial instincts instantly activating. "That is fraud, Natalie. If she is doing this to secure financial assets in a marriage, she is crossing a very dangerous legal line." "I know," I replied softly, "and my parents are helping her cover it up. Tomorrow morning, I am going to find out exactly why. They have poked the wrong bear, and I am about to tear their entire financial history apart." It was just past 9 the next morning when the serene, quiet atmosphere of my corporate accounting firm was violently shattered. I was sitting at my sleek glass desk reviewing a complex offshore tax audit when my office phone buzzed frantically. My assistant sounded panicked. She told me there was a highly agitated man in the lobby demanding to see me, and he was refusing to leave. Before she could even finish her sentence, I heard muffled, angry shouting echoing through the heavy oak doors of my suite. I stood up, smoothed down my tailored navy maternity blazer, and walked out into the reception area. Richard was standing in the middle of the pristine marble lobby, his face flushed a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He was waving a thick stack of legal papers in the air, aggressively jabbing his finger at our bewildered security guard. He looked entirely out of place among the quiet professionals walking the halls. I walked calmly toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I instructed the security guard to stand down and gestured for my father to step inside my private office. I refused to let him turn my workplace into a stage for his theatrical temper tantrums. He stormed past me without a word, radiating a furious, chaotic energy. The moment the heavy office door clicked shut behind us, Richard absolutely exploded. He slammed the stack of papers down onto my glass desk with such force that my coffee cup rattled. It was the commercial eviction notice my property manager had delivered by registered courier earlier that morning. "You have completely lost your mind," Richard screamed, a vein bulging in his neck. He began pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. "How dare you buy my office building behind my back? You are a vindictive, hateful daughter. You are trying to destroy your own family just because you are jealous of your sister. You think you can use your little corporate landlord status to bully us into submission. You are going to call your management company right now and cancel this eviction, or I swear to God, I will ruin you." I stood behind my desk and let him vent his rage. I watched him flail and scream, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. He was expecting me to cower, to cry, or to engage in a screaming match. When he finally ran out of breath, leaning heavily against the back of a guest chair and demanding my compliance, I simply sat down. I did not raise my voice. I opened my bottom desk drawer, pulled out a thick black leather-bound ledger, and slid it directly across the glass surface toward him. "Open it, Richard." I commanded, my tone stripped of any familial warmth. He hesitated, his arrogant glare faltering slightly before he snatched the folder and flipped it open. Inside was a complete, unredacted financial breakdown of his real estate company. After discovering Brittany's forged ultrasound the night before, I had stayed up late running a full forensic audit on his business accounts using public and corporate databases. Let us drop the delusion that this is about a wedding rivalry, I said coolly. Look at page 3. Those are the records of your last 3 consecutive rent checks. All of them bounced due to insufficient funds. Look at page 7. That is a detailed summary of the massive, overwhelming corporate debt your company is currently drowning in, including the high-interest, predatory loans you took out just to maintain your fake upper-class lifestyle. Richard's eyes darted rapidly across the spreadsheets. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The booming, authoritative patriarch from 2 minutes ago had instantly vanished. You are not being evicted because I am holding a grudge. I continued, leaning forward and resting my hands on the desk. You are being evicted because you are a fundamentally incompetent businessman who has not paid rent in 90 days. You are a liability to my real estate portfolio. I own that building free and clear, and I do not subsidize failing tenants. He swallowed hard, staring at the undeniable proof of his financial ruin. Natalie, please. He started, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. If you kick us out, the business will collapse completely. We have nowhere else to go. I ignored his pathetic shift in tone. The 30-day notice was a standard professional courtesy. I stated, my voice like ice. But after your unacceptable performance in my lobby this morning, that courtesy is officially revoked. You have exactly 48 hours to pack up your entire office and vacate the premises. If your company is not completely gone by Friday morning, I will personally call the sheriff to have your property seized and your employees forcibly escorted out of my building. Now get out of my office before I call security. Richard stared at me. The icy finality in my voice seemed to finally penetrate the thick layer of delusion he had lived in for decades. He looked from the open ledger on my desk to my face, searching for a trace of the daughter who used to desperately seek his approval. He found nothing. I watched his entire physical posture collapse. The broad shoulders slumped, the aggressive chest caved in, and his hands began to tremble. It was a spectacular, pathetic unraveling of a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of power. He sank into the guest chair, burying his face in his hands. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. The bespoke suit he wore suddenly looked too big for him, like a costume he had stolen. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bloodshot and filled with genuine, unadulterated terror. Natalie, please. He begged, his voice cracking. He sounded like a terrified child, not a titan of real estate. You cannot do this. You do not understand what is at stake here. The wedding tomorrow is the only thing keeping the creditors from tearing us apart. Devin's family is practically royalty in Atlanta. The moment Brittany marries him, we secure a massive line of credit just by association. We can save the firm. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I do not care about your lines of credit, Richard. I care about my property. You have 48 hours. He shook his head frantically, leaning so far forward he was practically laying on my glass desk. It is not just the creditors, he hissed, desperation making him careless. The IRS is actively auditing our corporate accounts. We moved money, Natalie. We moved a lot of money we did not actually have, hiding it in shell LLCs to keep up appearances. If this company goes under before the wedding, before the baby arrives, the federal government is going to indict your mother and me for tax evasion. I raised an eyebrow. Tax evasion is a serious federal crime, I said calmly. But that still does not explain why you drove to my apartment and threatened to make me homeless just to force me to abort my child. Brittany marrying a rich doctor does not magically erase federal tax fraud. Devin is not going to write a check to the IRS for a family he barely knows. Richard was completely spiraling now. The pressure of keeping up the lies had completely broken his cognitive filters. He gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white, his eyes wild and unblinking. "You do not get it," he yelled, his voice strained and hoarse. "It is not about Devon's money. It is about the trust. If you ruin this wedding, if you have your baby first, we lose the trust completely. If Brittany does not have the first baby, the money stays locked, and your mother and I are going to federal prison." The words hit the air like a physical shockwave. Richard instantly froze. His eyes went wide with pure, unfiltered horror as his own brain caught up to what his mouth had just blurted out. He slapped his hand over his mouth physically, trying to shove the words back in, but it was too late. The damage was irreparably done. I sat perfectly still. My forensic mind instantly dissected the 3 crucial data points he had just handed me. The trust, the first baby, federal prison. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent, sickening clarity. The forged ultrasound I found in Brittany's purse, the theatrical morning sickness, the unhinged demand for an abortion. It was never about bridesmaids' dresses or aesthetic wedding photos. It was about a hidden pool of money that was somehow tied directly to the birth order of the next generation. My unborn child was not an inconvenience to their social climbing. My child was a direct, catastrophic financial threat to their survival. Richard scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward away from my desk, as if the glass surface had suddenly caught fire. "Natalie." I did not mean that, he stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Forget I said that. You are confused. I am just stressed." I stood up slowly, picking up the heavy ledger and tossing it back into my bottom drawer. "I am not confused at all, Richard. In fact, I have never seen things more clearly in my entire life." I walked around the desk and opened my office door, gesturing toward the reception area. "The 48-hour deadline stands. If you are not out of my building by Friday, you will have a lot more to worry about than a corporate eviction. Get out of my sight." He looked like he wanted to argue, to beg, to try and spin another frantic lie. But he looked at my face and realized he was completely out of ammunition. He turned and practically ran out of the office, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor of the lobby. I shut the heavy oak door and locked it. I walked back to my desk, my heart pounding a slow, rhythmic beat of adrenaline. I sat down and pulled my keyboard toward me. I did not know what trust he was talking about yet. I had never heard of any generational wealth in our family, but I was an expert at finding hidden money, and I was about to hunt down every single dime. The lock on my office door clicked into place, but the silence inside did not bring me peace. It brought absolute lethal focus. I walked back to my desk, my mind racing with the 3 words my father had just accidentally handed me. The trust, the first baby, federal prison. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair, cracked my knuckles, and woke up my triple monitor workstation. My grandfather passed away 12 years ago. For as long as I could remember, Richard had bitterly complained that the old man had left him nothing but a struggling real estate firm and a mountain of unfulfilled expectations. Richard always claimed the estate was entirely bankrupt upon his death. It was the founding myth of our family's supposed financial struggles before Richard miraculously turned the business around. I now knew that was a blatant lie. I opened my firm's proprietary legal database, bypassing the standard public records and tapping directly into the state and federal probate archives. I ran a deep search on my grandfather's full legal name, cross-referencing it with my father's social security number and corporate tax identification numbers. For 10 minutes, the screen showed nothing but the standard publicly filed transfer of the commercial real estate business. But I am a forensic accountant. I know that people who want to hide money do not leave it sitting in the front yard. They bury it under layers of complex legal entities. I shifted my parameters, searching for irrevocable family trusts established in the state of Delaware during the year of my grandfather's death. I filtered the results by naming conventions tied to our family's original estate properties. There it was. A locked, heavily restricted file designated as the Generation Alpha Vanguard Trust. Because I was a direct bloodline descendant and possessed top-tier legal clearance through my federal accounting firm, I was able to bypass the superficial privacy blocks and access the unredacted charter document. I began to read the dense 60-page legal manuscript. By the time I reached page 14, the entire sickening conspiracy my family had built came crashing into the light. My grandfather was not stupid. He knew exactly what kind of man Richard was. He knew his son was a reckless, arrogant spender who would squander any direct inheritance on luxury cars and country club memberships. So my grandfather bypassed him completely. He took the bulk of his liquid wealth, placed it into a blind index fund, and legally sealed it. Over the last 12 years, that fund had quietly accumulated interest in the booming stock market. The current valuation sitting at the bottom of the ledger was a staggering $15.2 million, but it was the disbursement clause that made my blood run absolutely cold. The trust was legally engineered to remain entirely frozen until a very specific condition was met. The entire fund unlocks and full legal guardianship of the $15 million transfers immediately to the mother of the firstborn great-grandchild. I read the clause 3 times to ensure I was not hallucinating. The mother of the firstborn great-grandchild becomes the sole trustee until the child turns 21, granting her absolute discretionary power over the funds for the purpose of the child's welfare, housing, and lifestyle maintenance. It was a blank check. A $15 million blank check. I sat back, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark realization settling over me. Brittany was not just faking a pregnancy to manipulate a wealthy surgeon into marrying her. Devin was the prize, yes, but he was also the perfect cover. Brittany needed a husband who could provide her with an immediate, unquestioned alibi for a sudden baby, perhaps through a quick private adoption or a paid surrogate overseas that they could later pass off as a premature birth. But there was a massive, insurmountable obstacle standing in their way. Me. I was 12 weeks pregnant. My baby was real. My baby was going to be born in exactly 6 months. If I gave birth, the trust would automatically execute. I would instantly become the legal guardian of the $15 million, and Richard would not be able to touch a single penny to save his bankrupt company or pay off the IRS. That was why they were so terrified. That was why they were willing to do anything, say anything, and destroy any boundary to force me into an abortion clinic. My real baby was a ticking time bomb threatening to blow up their entire $15 million heist. If I terminated my pregnancy, Brittany would have the runway clear to produce her fake baby and claim the trust money for our parents to steal. They were literally willing to kill my unborn child to save themselves from federal prison. A cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The shock evaporated, leaving only pure weaponized clarity. I reached for my cell phone resting on the glass desk. I did not need to confront my parents. I did not need to scream at my sister. I needed to dismantle their entire operation from the inside out, piece by piece. And the first piece to pull was the innocent, honorable man they were currently using as a pawn. I found Devin's number in my contacts and pressed call. The line rang 3 times before Devin answered. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the low hum of the surgical ward in the background. He sounded exhausted, but maintained his usual professional demeanor. "Natalie," he said, his voice registering mild surprise. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Devin," I replied, keeping my tone soft, warm, and entirely unthreatening. "I know you are probably in the middle of a shift, but I wanted to call and sincerely apologize for the tension at the rehearsal dinner last night. My family has a habit of making things incredibly complicated, and it was entirely unfair that you and your parents were dragged into our dysfunction." Devin let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a man carrying a burden he did not fully understand. "I appreciate that, Natalie. My mother spoke to me after dinner. She was quite shaken by the miscommunication regarding your situation. I am just glad we cleared the air. I want our families to get along, especially now that we are both expecting." That was the perfect opening. I leaned forward in my chair, staring at the glowing trust document still illuminating my monitors. That is actually the other reason I called, I said, injecting just the right amount of sisterly concern into my voice. Since Brittany and I are both pregnant at the exact same time, I have been thinking a lot about our family medical history. There are a few genetic markers on my grandfather's side that I am currently having my doctor screen for. I wanted to make sure Brittany is doing the same. Genetic markers. Devin repeated, his protective instinct immediately kicking in. Brittany never mentioned anything about a family history. What kind of markers? Nothing immediately life-threatening, but definitely things an obstetrician should be monitoring during the first trimester. I lied smoothly. I needed a plausible medical excuse to push him into a corner. I figured the easiest thing to do would be for me to transfer my files to her doctor, or at least have our doctors consult each other. We are sisters, after all. Who is her doctor? I can just have my clinic reach out to their office directly. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of the hospital seemed to fade as Devin hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight-laced with an uncomfortable embarrassment that a man in his prestigious position should never have to feel. I actually do not know the name of her doctor, Natalie, Devin admitted quietly. I infused my voice with exactly the right amount of shock. You do not know. Devin, you are her fiancé. You are the father. I know, he said quickly, sounding defensive and incredibly tired. But Brittany has been extremely sensitive about the pregnancy. She says she has severe medical anxiety. Every time I offer to go to an appointment with her, she breaks down crying. She claims that having a surgeon in the room makes her feel analyzed instead of supported. She says she needs it to be her own private space until the second trimester. The manipulation was almost impressive. Brittany had found the one excuse that would force a caring, highly educated medical professional to back off. She weaponized his respect for her mental health. And she refuses to show you the ultrasound, I asked, gently guiding him toward the ledge. She brought one home yesterday, he said, his voice dropping lower. But when I asked to look closer at the gestational sac measurements, she snatched it away. She accused me of treating our baby like a clinical case study instead of a miracle. We had a huge fight about it. I just do not want to stress her out, Natalie, not in her first trimester. He sounded so profoundly troubled. He was a brilliant man whose logical brain was screaming that something was wrong, but his emotional heart was being held hostage by a pathological liar. I decided it was time to cut the strings. Devin, I said, my voice dropping its soft facade and becoming firm, clear, and commanding. You are an orthopedic surgeon. You spent over a decade in medical school and residency. You know how the human body works. You know standard medical protocols. You know what a healthy pregnancy looks like, and you know how patients behave. He did not interrupt me. He was listening intently. Do not let my family use your empathy against you, I continued. Take a step back from your relationship for a moment and look at the situation purely as a medical professional. Does her behavior align with any legitimate medical reality you have ever encountered in your career? Trust your instincts as a doctor, Devin. Your gut is telling you something is wrong for a reason. I did not wait for him to answer. I said a polite goodbye and ended the call. I placed my phone face down on the desk. The seed of doubt I had planted with his mother was now a fully grown tree inside Devin's own mind. He was going to start looking for the medical inconsistencies, and once a doctor starts looking for a disease, they always find it. I stood up, turned off my monitors, and prepared for my next move. The bridal shower was tomorrow, and I had a very special gift to deliver. 2 days before the wedding, the sky over the city was a brilliant cloudless blue, providing the perfect natural lighting for my sister's meticulously curated bridal shower. The event was held in the private glass conservatory of an upscale botanical garden. I did not receive an invitation, of course, but I did not need one. The location had been heavily advertised on Brittany's social media for weeks. She was treating the shower less like a family gathering and more like a sponsored corporate event. I arrived an hour after the start time, timing my entrance perfectly. I wore a tailored cream maternity dress that made my 12-week bump subtly but undeniably visible. I bypassed the confused event staff at the front entrance and walked straight into the sunlit conservatory. The room was breathtaking, filled with cascading floral arrangements, crystal champagne towers, and about 50 wealthy women mingling to the sound of a live string quartet. It took exactly 12 seconds for my mother to spot me. Beatrice was standing near a towering display of white orchids, chatting animatedly with a group of Devon's aunts. The moment her eyes locked onto me, her fake, radiant smile completely collapsed. She excused herself with a panicked flutter of her hands and marched across the marble floor to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. "What in the world are you doing here?" Beatrice hissed, grabbing my elbow and trying to yank me behind a large decorative pillar. "You were explicitly told to stay away. I will have security physically drag you out of here if you do not turn around right now." I calmly looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, and then looked her directly in the eye. "I highly doubt you want to cause a physical altercation in front of Devon's extended family." "Beatrice," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant, "especially not when I have brought my sister such a thoughtful present." I held up a medium-sized flat rectangular box, wrapped in expensive silver paper with a large silk bow. Beatrice stared at the box, her eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. "Whatever you are planning, it is not going to work," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You are not going to ruin her day. I am just here to give her a gift," I replied. "Now let go of my arm or I am going to scream and tell everyone you are hurting my baby." Beatrice recoiled as if I had burned her. She dropped her hand, her face flushing with terrified anger. She knew I had her completely trapped. She could not cause a scene without exposing the ugly cracks in our perfect family facade to the high society guests she so desperately wanted to impress. I smiled politely, stepped past her, and walked directly toward the front of the room. Brittany was sitting in a plush velvet chair, designed to look like a throne surrounded by a mountain of beautifully wrapped gifts. She was laughing loudly for a photographer's camera, playing the role of the glowing, perfect bride. When she saw me approaching, the laughter died in her throat. She froze, her eyes darting frantically toward our mother, who was trailing behind me, looking completely helpless. "Natalie," Brittany stammered, forcing a wide, painfully unnatural smile as the photographer kept snapping pictures. "I did not think you were going to make it. I would not miss celebrating your pregnancy for the world," I said loudly, making sure the women sitting nearby could hear me. "I brought you something very special for the nursery." I extended the silver box toward her. Brittany hesitated. She looked at the box as if it were a live explosive. But with dozens of eyes watching her and Devon's mother Gloria sitting just a few feet away, she had absolutely no choice but to accept it. She placed the box on her lap and slowly pulled the silk ribbon. "Go ahead," I encouraged her, my tone dripping with sweet sisterly affection. "Open it." Brittany tore the silver paper away and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a heavy, ornate silver picture frame. She picked it up and turned it around to look at the image inside. All the blood instantly drained from Brittany's face. Her skin turned a sickly ashen gray. Inside the frame was a high-resolution, crystal-clear printout of the forged ultrasound I had photographed from her purse. But I had made one crucial addition before printing it. On the bottom right corner of the glossy photo I had left the hospital's original encrypted QR code completely intact and highly visible. I leaned forward, resting my hand gently on the arm of her velvet chair, and lowered my voice so only she could hear me. "If anyone scans that code with their phone, Brittany, it links directly to my secure patient portal at the hospital," I whispered. "It will show them my name, my medical ID, and the exact date I took that scan." Brittany stopped breathing. Her hands began to shake so violently that the silver frame rattled against the armrest of the chair. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a pure, primal terror. The arrogant, entitled influencer was completely gone. She realized in that exact moment that I knew absolutely everything, and that I held the power to destroy her entire life with a single scan of a barcode. "Oh my God!" Brittany gasped loudly, dropping the frame face down onto her lap as if it were burning her skin. She slapped her hand over her mouth, jumped up from the velvet chair, and knocked over a tray of empty champagne glasses in her haste. Without saying another word, she shoved her way through the crowd of confused guests and sprinted out of the conservatory toward the restrooms, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and a mother who looked ready to faint. The sun had barely set over the Manhattan skyline when the private elevator chimed in the foyer of my penthouse. I had instructed my concierge to let my parents up the moment they inevitably arrived. I knew the bridal shower incident would force their hand. They could no longer pretend I was just a jealous sister. They knew I had the medical proof of Brittany's fraud, and judging by the sheer panic they were about to bring into my home, they suspected I knew about the money too. I stood in the center of my living room wearing comfortable cashmere loungewear. Before the elevator doors even opened, I picked up my phone, opened my smart home security application, and ensured the hidden high-definition cameras positioned in the ceiling corners were actively recording both video and crystal-clear audio. Richard and Beatrice stepped into the foyer. They looked absolutely horrific. The polished, arrogant veneer they had weaponized my entire life was completely shattered. Richard's tie was loosened, his face pale and drawn. Beatrice looked like she had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands shook as she clutched a thick leather portfolio. They did not scream this time. They did not threaten to evict me or hurl insults. They walked into my living room with the grim, quiet demeanor of hostages walking to an execution. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the white leather sofa across from the glass coffee table. They sat stiffly. Richard placed the leather portfolio onto the glass surface. He unzipped it and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, sliding them toward me. He did not look angry anymore. He looked like a man who was completely out of options. "We are done fighting, Natalie," Richard said, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual booming authority. "You win. You figured it out. We know you looked up your grandfather's trust. We know you have the evidence to expose Brittany. We are here to make a final business arrangement." I did not touch the papers. What kind of arrangement, I asked, intentionally keeping my voice steady and loud enough for the overhead microphones to capture perfectly. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "We took out a massive loan against the last remaining equity in the company," she whispered frantically. "A private hard money lender. It is incredibly dangerous, but it was the only way to get cash fast. We are prepared to offer you $500,000 transferred directly into an offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning." $500,000. I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the quiet room. "And what exactly are you buying with that money?" Richard tapped the top of the legal contract. "A clean break. The contract stipulates that you will board a private flight to Geneva, Switzerland tomorrow evening. We have already arranged a discreet appointment at an elite private clinic. You will terminate the pregnancy. After the procedure, you will sign a legally binding renunciation form permanently waiving your rights to the Generation Alpha Vanguard Trust." The sheer depravity of the offer was breathtaking. They were sitting in my living room, casually offering me $500,000 of borrowed mob money to murder my child so they could execute a $15 million heist. I needed to get the full confession on the record. I picked up the contract and flipped to the second page, pretending to consider it. "Let me make sure I understand the terms of this deal," I said, looking directly at my parents. "You want me to abort my baby. You want me to do this so Brittany can continue to fake her pregnancy to Devon, pretend to give birth to the first great-grandchild, and claim the $15 million from grandfather's trust. And you need her to do this because you have committed federal tax evasion and are going to prison if you do not inject that trust money into your bankrupt real estate firm. Is that entirely correct?" The silence in the room was heavy. Richard looked down at his hands, ashamed, but completely unapologetic. "Yes," Richard admitted, his voice a pathetic croak. "That is the reality of the situation. If you do not take this deal, Natalie, we lose everything. We go to federal prison. Your sister is ruined. We are begging you. You can have another baby later. Just take the money and let us survive." Beatrice began to sob quietly, burying her face in her hands. "Please, Natalie, do not destroy your family." I let the camera record her fake manipulative tears for 5 full seconds. Then I dropped the contract back onto the glass table. The heavy thud made them both jump. "I am not taking your blood money," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "And I am not signing away a single right to my child's inheritance. You built a house of lies and now it is burning to the ground." Richard's face hardened. The desperation instantly vanished, replaced by a dark-cornered fury. "If you do not take this money," he hissed, "we will have security physically drag you away from that church. You will never get near Devin or his family." I stood up, crossing my arms over my chest. "I highly recommend you leave my home before my husband returns," I said coldly. They grabbed the contract and practically ran for the elevator. I watched the doors close behind them. I immediately pulled out my phone and saved the video file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I had the entire conspiracy, the bribery, and the financial motives fully documented. The trap was set, and the wedding was in less than 48 hours. Before the polished brass doors of the private elevator could fully slide shut, Richard lunged forward and slapped his hand against the sensor. The doors jerked back open. He stepped halfway out of the cab, his face a mask of cornered, feral desperation. "If you think you can just dismiss us and walk away, you are dead wrong." Richard spat, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "I am hiring private armed security for the church on Saturday. I will give them your photograph and strict orders to deny you entry. If you even step foot on the cathedral grounds, you will be arrested for trespassing. You are not going to ruin Brittany. You are not going to take that trust fund from us." I did not flinch. I took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches from his flushed, angry face. "I want you to look up, Richard," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Look at the top right corner of the foyer ceiling, and then look at the corner above the living room window." Richard blinked, his eyes darting upward. He spotted the small black high-definition camera lenses blinking with a faint red recording light. Beatrice, standing behind him in the elevator cab, let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth in absolute horror. "This entire penthouse is wired with a state-of-the-art security system," I explained, enunciating every single word with lethal precision. "It records in brilliant 4K resolution and captures crystal-clear audio, which means I now have a pristine digital file of you and Beatrice sitting on my sofa, confessing to federal tax evasion and offering me $500,000 in illicit loan money to coerce me into a medical procedure so you can commit a $15 million probate fraud." Richard's jaw went completely slack. The color vanished from his face so quickly I thought his legs might give out under his own weight. "I am going to attend my sister's wedding on Saturday." I continued, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. "I am going to walk through the front doors of that church, and I am going to take my seat. If a single security guard tries to touch me, or if you attempt to bar my entry in any way, I will not call the local police. I will immediately hand this unedited video file over to my husband. Daniel is an assistant United States attorney. Do you want to guess how fast a federal prosecutor can secure an indictment for extortion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud when he has a taped confession from the primary suspects?" Richard could not speak. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of his own unbelievable hubris. "If you want to spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary, Richard, go ahead and tell your security guards to stop me. Otherwise, I will see you at the ceremony." I reached out and pressed the lobby button on the elevator panel. Richard stumbled backward into the cab, his eyes wide with a pure, hollow terror. The brass doors slid shut, sealing them inside, and the elevator hummed quietly as it descended. 20 minutes later, the front door unlocked and Daniel walked in. He dropped his briefcase by the console table and loosened his tie, looking exhausted from his long day at the federal courthouse. His fatigue vanished the second he saw the look on my face. "What happened?" Daniel asked, his prosecutorial instincts instantly snapping to attention. I walked him into my home office, sat him down in the leather chair, and played the security footage. Daniel sat in absolute silence as he watched my parents offer me blood money to terminate our unborn child. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. When the video ended, the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Daniel did not yell. He did not throw anything. His anger was far more dangerous than that. It was cold, calculating, and entirely focused on the absolute destruction of the people who had threatened his family. "They are going to try and stop you at the church anyway," Daniel said, his voice hard and flat. "Men like your father do not surrender until they are completely out of oxygen. He will hire the guards, hoping my federal badge will not be enough to breach private property without a warrant." "Then we make sure we do not need a warrant," I replied, pulling up a digital blueprint of the cathedral I had found online. We walk in through the main entrance together. You flash your federal credentials. You tell the private security that interfering with a federal officer during an active investigation is a felony. They are paid $20 an hour. They are not going to risk prison for Richard. "We are going to need physical copies of everything," Daniel said, opening his briefcase to pull out crisp legal folders. The forged ultrasound with the hospital QR code, the medical billing receipt for Brittany's intrauterine device that you found in the audit, and a certified transcript of this bribery conversation. When we expose them at the altar, we do not just tell the crowd. We hand the undeniable evidence directly to Devin in front of his entire family. We leave absolutely zero room for your sister to cry and spin another lie. For the next 3 hours, we sat side by side in the glow of the monitors. We printed the high-resolution documents, placed them into heavy stock presentation folders, and orchestrated a flawless, airtight execution plan. We timed exactly when to enter the sanctuary for maximum impact. We anticipated every single countermeasure Richard might attempt, and neutralized it legally. My family had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and my resolve. On Saturday, they were going to learn exactly why you never go to war with a forensic accountant. Saturday arrived with crisp, brilliant weather. The wedding took place at an opulent cathedral in the heart of Manhattan. It was a $200,000 production designed to project an image of generational wealth. From half a block away, I could see the cascading arches of white roses framing the heavy oak doors and the line of luxury vehicles idling at the curb. It was a glittering stage set for a play that was about to be canceled. I sat in the back of our hired car, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I chose a floor-length, deep sapphire gown. It was elegant, commanding, and draped perfectly over my 12-week bump. I did not look like the discarded pariah my family painted me as. Beside me, Daniel looked formidable in a tailored charcoal suit, his federal badge clipped securely inside his breast pocket, resting next to the presentation folders containing our explosive evidence. The car pulled up to the curb. Daniel stepped out first, offering his hand. As we walked up the sweeping stone steps toward the main entrance, the sheer scale of my father's paranoia became visible. Richard had not just hired a standard event coordinator, he hired a private armed security firm. Standing squarely in front of the massive carved wooden doors were 2 imposing men in sharp black suits, complete with earpieces and visible holsters beneath their jackets. As we approached the top of the stairs, one man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small laminated card. I could clearly see my own face printed on it. It was a photo from my corporate profile. Richard had given them a hit list. The guard stepped directly into my path, holding his hand up in a firm gesture to stop. "Excuse me, ma'am," the guard said, his voice flat. "I am going to have to ask you to step back. You are not on the approved guest list for this event." I stood my ground. "I am the sister of the bride," I said politely. The guard glanced down at the photo. "I am aware of who you are. I have direct orders from the father of the bride that you are explicitly barred from entering the premises. If you attempt to go through these doors, we are authorized to physically remove you and contact local law enforcement. Please walk back to your vehicle." He crossed his arms, widening his stance to block the entrance. The second guard stepped up beside him, silently reinforcing the barricade. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Daniel stepped forward smoothly, placing himself between me and the two guards. He did not raise his voice. He looked at them with the cold, assessing gaze of a man who put dangerous criminals in federal prison for a living. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his leather credential case. He flipped it open, revealing the heavy gold shield of the United States Department of Justice and his federal identification card. He held it up right in front of the primary guard's face. "My name is Daniel, and I am an assistant United States attorney," my husband said, his voice carrying lethal authority. "The woman you are threatening is my wife. More importantly, she is a key witness in an active federal investigation regarding wire fraud and tax evasion directly involving the man who hired you today." The guard's posture instantly stiffened. His eyes darted from the gold federal shield to Daniel's unblinking stare. "We are entering this building," Daniel continued, putting his badge away. "If you lay a single finger on my wife or if you attempt to impede our entry, I will have you both placed under immediate federal arrest for the obstruction of a federal officer and witness tampering. I highly doubt Richard is paying you enough to risk a mandatory minimum sentence." The silence that followed was absolute. The guard looked at his partner. They both did the math in their heads. A private security contract was not worth a federal indictment. The primary guard cleared his throat, suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Understood, sir," the guard muttered, taking a large step backward and lowering his hands. "We do not want any trouble with the federal government." He pulled open the heavy oak door, clearing our path completely. Daniel offered me his arm. I slipped my hand through his, keeping my head high as we walked past the neutralized blockade. We stepped out of the sunlight and into the cool vestibule of the cathedral. The distant chords of the organ echoed through the stone hallways. The wedding march was about to begin, and the bride had absolutely no idea that her worst nightmare had just walked through the front door. Daniel and I stepped into the cavernous rear of the cathedral just as the heavy wooden doors closed behind us. The thick oak sealed us inside, instantly muffling the distant sirens and traffic of the city. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. Towering stone arches stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, and every available pillar was wrapped in thousands of imported white roses and lush greenery. The wooden pews were packed tight with over 300 guests. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilies and expensive designer perfumes. We remained standing in the deep shadows of the back row, perfectly concealed from the families seated at the front of the sanctuary. At the altar stood Devon. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but his physical posture lacked the relaxed, radiant joy of a man about to marry the love of his life. His broad shoulders were rigid. His eyes darted slightly, analyzing his surroundings with the sharp, unsettled focus of a surgeon trying to diagnose a complex internal problem. My phone call had worked perfectly. He was no longer a blind, devoted fiancé, eagerly awaiting his bride. He was a man actively looking for the disease I had warned him about. The string quartet swelled into a sweeping classical piece, signaling the arrival of the bride. The entire crowd stood in unison. Brittany appeared at the top of the aisle, escorted by Richard. She wore a custom silk gown that must have cost a small fortune, the heavy train gliding effortlessly over the white carpet. She looked absolutely triumphant. She was smiling radiantly, playing the role of the glowing pregnant bride with sickening perfection. Beside her, Richard walked with his chest puffed out, practically vibrating with arrogant victory. He never once looked back toward the entrance to check the doors. He blindly assumed his hired guards had done their job and kept his nightmare entirely neutralized outside. As they reached the altar, Richard handed Brittany off to Devon. I watched Devon's face with forensic precision. He did not smile broadly. He accepted her hand with a polite, measured nod, his jaw tight. In the front row on the groom's side, Gloria sat perfectly straight. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She was watching Brittany with the cold, calculating eyes of a matriarch who knew a storm was coming, but did not yet know the exact direction of the wind. The pastor, a tall, imposing man in flowing white robes, stepped up to the wooden podium and raised his hands to quiet the murmuring crowd. The ceremony officially began. He spoke eloquently about love, unwavering devotion, and the beautiful merging of two prominent families. He talked about the future, about building a lasting foundation of truth and mutual respect. The bitter irony of his words echoed loudly off the stone walls. I stood perfectly still next to Daniel, gripping the heavy presentation folders containing the exact evidence that would burn that very foundation to ash in a matter of minutes. The ceremony progressed with a tense, suffocating rhythm. Brittany recited her vows in a soft, heavily rehearsed voice. She made a point to occasionally press a delicate hand to her flat stomach for dramatic, maternal effect. It was a performance designed for an audience. Devin delivered his vows respectfully, but his voice lacked the deep emotional resonance of a man making a genuine lifetime commitment. The tension in the cathedral was thick and palpable, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fracture. Then the pastor reached the traditional, historically overlooked portion of the ceremony. He closed his leather-bound book and looked out over the sea of well-dressed, affluent guests. He took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a long, heavy moment before speaking the words that had been explicitly written into the script of my revenge. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The pastor paused. In a normal wedding, it was a mere formality, a brief 2-second silence before the joyful exchange of rings. But this was not a normal wedding, and my family was entirely abnormal. Daniel stepped aside, clearing my path. I walked out of the deep shadows at the back of the sanctuary and stepped squarely into the center of the white carpeted aisle. The sound of my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor rang out like gunshots in the dead quiet church. I did not raise my hand like a schoolchild asking for permission. I did not shout hysterically or cry. I projected my voice with the clear, unyielding authority of a woman who held absolute, undeniable power over the room. "I object," I said. My voice echoed off the high stone walls, slicing violently through the heavy air and reaching every single ear in the building. Hundreds of heads snapped around to look at me simultaneously. The collective gasp that rolled through the crowd was loud and genuine, a sharp intake of breath from 300 wealthy socialites who had never witnessed a real objection in their entire lives. At the altar, Brittany froze completely. Her perfectly practiced smile shattered instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I took another purposeful step forward, gripping the legal folders tightly against my side. "I object," I repeated, ensuring there was absolutely no confusion about why I was standing there. "On the grounds of medical and financial fraud." The word fraud hung in the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral like a physical weight. For 3 agonizing seconds, the sanctuary was so quiet I could hear the rustle of silk from the bridesmaids' dresses. Then the dam broke. Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical scream from the front pew. It was not a gasp of surprise, but a raw shriek of absolute terror. She jumped to her feet, knocking her expensive hymnal to the stone floor, her face twisting into a mask of pure panic. The sudden noise ignited the crowd. 300 wealthy guests erupted into a chaotic symphony of loud gasps, frantic whispers, and shifting bodies. On the groom's side of the church, the dignified composure of Devin's family instantly transformed into rigid shock. Gloria sat up bone straight, her dark eyes locking onto me with a fierce, calculating intensity. She remembered our conversation in the restaurant powder room. She knew exactly what was happening. At the altar, Brittany looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her hands flew to her mouth, her bouquet of white roses tumbling to the carpeted floor. Devin immediately took a large step away from her. He did not look angry yet. He looked like a surgeon who had just cracked open a chest and found something entirely unexpected and catastrophic. "Stop her!" Richard bellowed. My father's voice boomed over the rising chaos of the congregation. He had been standing near the front pew, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of my presence. When his brain finally registered that his multi-million-dollar heist was collapsing in front of 300 people, his survival instinct overrode any sense of social decorum. his face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He shoved past a groomsman and practically sprinted down the center aisle toward me. He was a large man fueled by pure cornered adrenaline. His heavy footsteps thudded aggressively against the white runner. His hands were curled into tight fists, and his eyes were wild with a violent desperation. He fully intended to grab me by the arms and physically drag me out of the sanctuary before I could say another word. "You ungrateful little brat," Richard spat, as he closed the distance between us, his voice dripping with venom. "I will kill you. I will literally kill you." He lunged forward, reaching his large hands out to grab the fabric of my sapphire dress. But he never made contact. Daniel moved with the fluid, calculated speed of a man who had faced down cartel bosses and corrupt politicians. He stepped smoothly in front of me, shielding my body with his own. As Richard thrust his hands forward, Daniel reached out and caught my father's right wrist mid-air. With a sharp practice motion, Daniel twisted Richard's arm downward and pinned it firmly against my father's own chest, locking his shoulder into a painful, completely immobilized position. Richard let out a sharp grunt of pain, his forward momentum crashing to an immediate halt. He struggled blindly for a second, but Daniel planted his feet and held the joint lock with unbreakable strength. Daniel leaned in close, but he pitched his voice so it carried clearly over the frantic murmurs of the crowd. "If you take one more aggressive step toward my wife, I will place you under federal arrest, right here on this carpet." Daniel said, his tone absolutely lethal and entirely devoid of emotion. Assaulting a federal prosecutor and a key witness to a financial crime carries a mandatory prison sentence. You are already looking at a decade for tax evasion, Richard. Do you really want to add violent assault to your federal indictment? The words hit Richard like a bucket of ice water. The wild, violent rage in his eyes flickered and died, instantly replaced by the crushing realization that he was completely outmatched. He was not bullying his teenage daughter in the privacy of their suburban home anymore. He was standing in a crowded cathedral, physically restrained by a federal officer who held his entire life in the palm of his hand. "Let go of me, Richard," whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and profound humiliation. Daniel held the lock for one more agonizing second, making sure the lesson was permanently ingrained in my father's mind. Then, with a look of pure disgust, Daniel released his grip and shoved Richard backward. Richard stumbled, his expensive suit jacket riding up his shoulders, looking pathetic as he caught his balance against a wooden pew. Daniel adjusted his tie, stepping slightly to the side to clear the path for me once again. He offered a slight, reassuring nod. I did not spare my father another glance. I stepped around his trembling frame and continued my walk down the center aisle. The cathedral had fallen into a dead, suffocating silence once more. The guests were entirely spellbound. They watched me glide past them in my sapphire gown, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I walked past rows of open mouths and wide eyes. Devon's affluent family watched me with a mixture of horror and deep respect. They recognized the undeniable power of a woman who refused to be silenced. I reached the front of the sanctuary and stopped just at the edge of the altar steps. I stood directly in front of the pastor, who was clutching his Bible as if it might shield him from the explosion. I looked up at Devon, who was staring at me with a desperate, questioning intensity. And then I turned my eyes to Brittany. She was shaking violently, her face slick with cold sweat. Her perfect day had officially become a crime scene, and I was holding all the evidence. The pastor took a hasty step backward, practically melting into the stone wall behind the altar. He wanted absolutely no part of the explosion that was about to occur. I stood just inches from the man who was supposed to become my brother-in-law. Devon looked down at me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between my calm expression and the heavy stock folders I held in my hands. I turned my gaze to my sister. Brittany looked as though all the blood had been drained from her body. Her hands were shaking so violently that the lace of her veil trembled against her shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to spin another desperate lie, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was trapped in front of 300 people and she knew I was holding the exact weapon that would destroy her. I shifted my attention back to the groom. I did not speak to the crowd. I spoke directly to him, my voice projecting with the clear, unyielding tone of a professional auditor presenting undeniable facts. "I told you on the phone to trust your medical instincts, Devon," I said. "You are a brilliant orthopedic surgeon. You spent over a decade training to analyze the human body and read complex diagnostic imaging. You know exactly what a healthy pregnancy looks like, and you know what a forgery looks like. I want you to scan this." I opened the thick presentation folder and pulled out the 2 high-resolution printouts Daniel and I had prepared the night before. I held them out. Devon hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. Then the surgeon in him took over. He reached out and took the papers from my hand. "The first page is the official medical record of my 8-week ultrasound," I explained, pointing to the document on the left. "You will notice the hospital logo, my full legal name, my patient identification number, and the encrypted QR code at the bottom. The second page is the exact ultrasound photo your bride brought home to you 3 days ago, claiming it was a picture of your unborn child." Devon held the 2 glossy pages side by side. I watched his eyes track across the images. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. As a medical professional, he did not need me to explain the nuances of the imaging. His brain automatically registered the visual data. He saw the identical, slightly asymmetrical shape of the gestational sac. He saw the exact same granular static patterns near the bottom edges, and then his eyes locked onto the top right corner. He saw the faded smudge from my hospital's defective printer. It was perfectly replicated on Brittany's supposedly original scan. "Look at the patient data at the top of her scan," Devon, I instructed softly. "Notice how my name and medical ID were digitally erased. Notice how her name is typed in a crisp Arial font that does not match the dot matrix text generated by standard hospital ultrasound equipment. It is not just a similar scan, it is a pixel-for-pixel match. She stole my medical file from a family group chat and literally photoshopped her own name over it." Devon's hands began to tremble. The heavy paper shook in his grip. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The morning sickness, the refusal to let him attend appointments, the tears about medical anxiety. It was all a meticulously choreographed stage play. There was no baby. There never was. "Devon, do not look at those," Brittany suddenly shrieked. Her voice cracked, shattering the silence of the sanctuary. Her survival instinct finally kicked in, manifesting as pure, unhinged denial. "She is lying. She hacked my phone. She fabricated those pictures because she wants to ruin us. You know how jealous she is. Please, Devon, you have to believe me." She lunged forward, reaching out with her manicured hands to snatch the papers away from him. But Devon did not let her take them. He took a sharp, aggressive step backward, pulling the evidence out of her reach. He looked up from the forged ultrasound and stared at the woman he was about to marry. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was absolute, profound revulsion. It was the look of a man staring at a total stranger. "You used a fake pregnancy to trap me," Devon whispered. His voice was incredibly quiet, but the acoustics of the cathedral carried the raw devastation in his tone to the front pews. "No," Brittany sobbed, reaching for his arm. "I swear I am pregnant. I am." Devon looked down at her hands, grasping his tuxedo sleeve. He physically recoiled, ripping his arm out of her grip as if her touch was toxic. He dropped the 2 ultrasound printouts. The glossy papers fluttered through the air, landing face up on the pristine white carpet between them, the undeniable proof of her betrayal lying right at her feet. He glared at her, his chest heaving as the illusion of his perfect bride burned to the ground. Brittany stared at the 2 glossy papers resting on the white carpet as if they were venomous snakes. When Devon stepped back from her, the final thread of her sanity snapped. She let out a guttural, desperate sob and fell to her knees, grabbing the heavy silk of his tuxedo pants. "You have to listen to me," Brittany wailed, the sound echoing painfully through the silent cathedral. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her flushed cheeks. She hacked my phone, Devon. She is a forensic accountant. She knows how to manipulate digital files and plant evidence. She stole my passwords and created those fake documents to frame me. She has been jealous of me her entire life, and she just wants to destroy my happiness because her own marriage is miserable. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch. Look at her. Look at how smug she is. She is a sociopath. I am carrying your child, Devon. You know I am. I have been sick every single morning. I have been picking out names with your mother. You cannot let her poison our family with her lies. Devon stood frozen, staring down at the woman clawing at his legs. A tiny, dangerous sliver of doubt flickered in his eyes. He was a man of science, but he was also a man who desperately wanted to believe in the goodness of the woman he loved. Gaslighting is a powerful tool, and Brittany was a master craftsman. She was weaving a narrative of victimhood so intense, so emotionally charged, that it threatened to override the clinical evidence he had just seen. From the front pew, Beatrice suddenly chimed in, attempting to reinforce the lie. She is telling the truth, Devon, my mother cried out, clutching her chest. Natalie has been threatening us all week. She is deeply unwell. I watched Devon waver for a fraction of a second, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I did not raise my voice to shout over their theatrical sobbing. I simply reached into the heavy stock presentation folder one last time. I felt Daniel step slightly closer to me, an immovable wall of support as I prepared to deliver the killing strike. If I hacked your phone to fabricate an ultrasound, Brittany, then I suppose I must have also hacked into our parents' joint banking accounts and fabricated their medical billing statements, I said, my voice cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel. Brittany instantly stopped crying. Her mouth hung open, her eyes locking onto the new sheet of paper I was pulling from the folder. The fake tears completely dried up, replaced by genuine, unadulterated dread. When our father barged into my office and inadvertently confessed to his financial crimes, I decided to run a full audit on the family accounts, I explained to Devon, keeping my tone entirely conversational. People who commit massive fraud often hide their tracks in the big purchases, but they almost always get sloppy with the small automated subscriptions and digital billing statements. I subpoenaed the family data using my firm's legal clearance and cross-referenced it with the shared credit card statements. I held up the crisp white paper. It was a certified financial ledger, heavily highlighted in yellow ink. This is a billing receipt from your private gynecologist's office dated exactly 2 months ago, I stated clearly, ensuring the acoustics of the sanctuary carried every single syllable to the crowd. It was charged to the family credit card and synced directly to your digital wallet. I took 2 steps forward and handed the paper directly to Devon. He took it, his eyes scanning the highlighted lines with brutal efficiency. As a surgeon, you are fully aware of what a Paragard is, I said, watching Devon's face turn to absolute stone. It is a copper intrauterine device. According to this billing statement, Brittany had it surgically inserted exactly 8 weeks ago, right around the time she supposedly conceived this miracle baby. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. The air felt heavy, completely devoid of oxygen. Devon stared at the medical billing code printed on the paper. The realization hit him with a physical force. The entire elaborate charade crumbled into dust. You cannot get pregnant with an IUD, Brittany, I said, delivering the final fatal blow to her illusion. You just needed to trap him before I gave birth. Brittany collapsed backward onto the floor, the heavy layers of her custom silk gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She did not try to argue. She did not try to scream that the document was fake. The sheer, terrifying accuracy of the medical receipt had entirely stripped her of her ability to lie. She sat on the floor of the cathedral, staring blankly ahead, completely destroyed by the undeniable truth. Devon slowly lowered the paper. The last remnants of his conflicted sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. He had been targeted. He had been hunted by a family of financial predators who saw his medical degree, and his affluent background as nothing more than a life raft to save themselves from ruin. He looked down at Brittany, who was now weeping silently into her hands. The disgust radiating from him was palpable. The wedding was officially over. The trap was broken. And the entire congregation sat in stunned, breathless silence as the golden child faced the ultimate, inescapable consequence of her greed. The silence in the cathedral was suffocating. Devon took another heavy step back from Brittany, who was now reduced to a sobbing heap of white silk on the altar steps. I could see the burning questions forming in the eyes of the guests. Why would a wealthy, beautiful woman go to such psychotic lengths to trap a man she was already engaged to? Why forge medical documents and fake a pregnancy when a lavish wedding was already planned and paid for? I turned away from my sister and faced the congregation. It was time to pull back the final curtain. I looked directly at Gloria, who was sitting rigidly in the front pew, and then swept my gaze across the sea of my parents' affluent friends, country club associates, and business partners. My sister did not orchestrate this elaborate charade simply because she was desperate for a husband. I announced, my voice carrying clearly to the very last row of the sanctuary. Devon is a wonderful, honorable man, but to this family he was nothing more than a highly respectable alibi. This entire marriage was the foundation of a calculated multi-million-dollar financial heist. Gasps rippled through the wooden pews. Richard let out a strangled, panicked noise from the sidelines and took a half-step forward. But Daniel immediately shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders, and my father instantly froze, absolutely terrified of the federal prosecutor standing guard. I smoothed the fabric of my sapphire dress and continued. 12 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left behind a sealed, irrevocable trust, currently valued at over $15 million, I explained, watching the eyes of the wealthy guests widen at the staggering sum. But my grandfather knew exactly how reckless and corrupt his son was. He knew Richard would squander every penny. So he locked the money away with a very specific, unbreakable legal stipulation. The trust and full guardianship of the $15 million transfers immediately and exclusively to the mother of the firstborn great-grandchild. I placed my hand gently over my stomach. I am 12 weeks pregnant. My child will be the firstborn, which means I am the sole legal guardian of that entire estate. My parents' real estate company is completely bankrupt. They have been bouncing rent checks for months, they are drowning in predatory loans, and they are currently under active federal investigation for tax evasion. They are facing imminent prison time. They desperately needed that $15 million to save themselves, but they could not touch a single cent of it as long as my baby existed. The collective horror of the crowd was a physical weight in the room. I watched the faces of my parents' peers contort in absolute disgust. They needed Brittany to have the first child to unlock the vault, I said, pointing down at my weeping sister. But she was not pregnant. So they hatched a plan to fake a pregnancy, secure a wealthy doctor as an unquestionable cover story, and likely use a secret surrogate overseas or stage a miraculous premature birth later to claim the money. But first they had to eliminate my child to clear the path. Beatrice suddenly stood up from the front pew. She was shaking violently, her hands raised in a pathetic, frantic gesture of denial. "Do not listen to her!" My mother shrieked, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her impending social ruin. "She is insane. She is making all of this up. We would never do such a terrible thing. We are a respectable family." I did not argue with her. I did not need to. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I walked over to the wooden podium where the pastor had been standing just moments before. I placed my phone directly in front of the live microphone, tapped the screen, and hit play on the digital audio file I had exported from my penthouse security system 2 nights ago. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio of my parents' voices boomed through the cathedral speakers. The congregation heard Richard frantically admitting to the tax evasion and the looming federal indictment. They heard Beatrice sobbing explicitly, offering me $500,000 in illicit hard money loans. And then the most damning sentence of all echoed off the high stone walls. They heard Richard explicitly instructing me to board a private flight to Switzerland, terminate my pregnancy, and sign away my legal rights to the $15 million trust so they could avoid federal prison. The recording stopped. The click of the audio ending sounded exactly like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. The devastation was absolute and irreversible. The wealthy, flawless facade my parents had spent 30 years building was instantly annihilated in front of their entire social circle. The affluent peers they had tried so desperately to impress were looking at them not just as financial frauds, but as monsters willing to buy the abortion of their own grandchild to cover up a felony. Beatrice covered her face with her hands, letting out a wretched guttural sob, while Richard stared blankly at the floor, his entire empire reduced to ashes in front of 300 horrified witnesses. The echo of the audio recording faded into the high vaulted ceilings of the cathedral, but the absolute horror of the words remained suspended in the air. Devon stood at the altar, his broad shoulders trembling. He was a doctor who had sworn an oath to preserve human life, and he had just listened to the parents of the woman he loved casually negotiate the termination of their own grandchild to secure a massive financial payout. The sheer, unfathomable evil of the conspiracy washed over him. He slowly turned his head away from the stunned congregation and looked down at the floor. Brittany was completely unraveled. She was sobbing hysterically, her hands clutching the edges of her custom silk gown, rocking back and forth on the white carpet. The flawless Vogue aesthetic she had obsessed over for months was entirely ruined. Dark streams of mascara stained her face, and her carefully styled hair was plastered to her cheeks with cold sweat. She looked up at Devon, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She reached out her trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the polished leather of his shoe. "Devon, please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper through her tears. "I love you. We can still fix this. We can just leave." Devon looked down at her, and the last remaining fragment of his broken heart hardened into pure, impenetrable ice. He did not see a terrified bride. He saw a predator who had targeted his medical credentials and his family's pristine reputation to build an alibi for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He slowly stepped back, pulling his foot out of her reach. "You do not love me, Brittany," Devon said, his voice dropping into a register so cold and quiet it made the guests in the front rows shiver. "You do not even know what love is. You needed a wealthy surgeon to validate a fake pregnancy, and you were perfectly willing to let your parents murder your unborn niece or nephew to get your hands on that money. You sicken me." He lifted his gaze from her sobbing form and looked directly at Richard and Beatrice. My mother was still covering her face, weeping into her hands, but Richard was staring back at Devon with the hollow, vacant expression of a man who knew his life was officially over. "You are a disgusting excuse for a father," Devon said, his voice echoing clearly across the silent sanctuary. "You sold your own daughter to a hitman in a medical clinic for a paycheck. You belong in a federal prison, and I hope they throw away the key." Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to offer one last pathetic lie, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Daniel, the federal prosecutor, standing stoically in the aisle, and quickly looked down at the floor, completely defeated. Devon reached up to the lapel of his tailored black tuxedo. With precise, deliberate movements, he unpinned the white rose boutonniere that perfectly matched Brittany's bridal bouquet. He pulled the pin free and held the delicate flower in his hand for a fraction of a second. Then, without breaking eye contact with the weeping woman on the floor, he opened his fingers. The white rose dropped, landing softly on the trailing edge of Brittany's expensive lace veil. It was the ultimate, undeniable symbol of finality. The wedding was dead. Devon turned his back on the altar. He did not wait for the pastor to speak. He walked down the 3 marble steps, his posture perfectly straight, radiating the quiet, formidable dignity he had inherited from his parents. He bypassed my parents entirely and walked directly to the front pew on the left side of the aisle. He stopped in front of his mother. Gloria was already standing. Her dark eyes were filled with a fierce protective pride for her son. Devin reached out and gently took his mother's hands in his own. "I am so incredibly sorry," Mom, Devin said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I am sorry I brought these people into our lives, and I am sorry I brought this humiliation upon our family." Gloria squeezed his hands firmly. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, Devin," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "You are a good man who was deceived by wicked people. We are leaving now." Gloria released his hands and turned to her husband. Devin's father offered a sharp, authoritative nod. The silent cue rippled backward through the pews. What happened next was the most powerful display of collective self-respect I have ever witnessed. The entire groom's side of the church moved as one. Dozens of highly educated, affluent African-American guests stood up in perfect unified synchronization. There was no shouting. There were no dramatic insults hurled across the aisle. There was only the rustle of expensive fabric and the sharp clicks of leather shoes turning toward the exit. Devin offered me his arm as he passed by. I smiled softly, declining the gesture, gesturing for him to stay with his mother. He nodded, a look of profound gratitude passing between us. He walked down the center aisle, flanked by his parents, leading his family out of the toxic wreckage. The bride's side of the church remained seated, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal. They sat in suffocating silence, forced to watch the entire family of the groom walk out the heavy oak doors, taking all the dignity, respect, and social standing with them. Brittany's wails echoed off the stone walls, but nobody rushed to comfort her. My parents were left standing in the ruins of their shattered empire, entirely abandoned, drowning in absolute humiliation as the reality of their impending federal indictment finally settled over them. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung shut behind the last departing member of Devin's family. But the mass exodus did not stop there. The bride's side of the church, filled with my parents' country club associates and high society business partners, immediately followed suit. There were no polite goodbyes or sympathetic hugs offered to the family at the altar. The affluent guests gathered their expensive coats and designer purses in an awkward, hurried silence. They kept their heads down, actively avoiding eye contact with my mother, who was still weeping loudly in the front pew. Within minutes, the massive $200,000 production was entirely abandoned. The only people left in the cavernous, flower-filled sanctuary were me, Daniel, my sobbing sister on the floor, and my parents. The sudden emptiness of the church seemed to strip away the last remaining shreds of Richard's self-preservation. Without the watchful eyes of his wealthy peers to keep his temper in check, his initial shock quickly curdled into a violent, unhinged rage. He turned away from the exit and locked his bloodshot eyes on me. "You destroyed us!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely off the high stone arches. He stomped toward me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He stopped just a few feet away, practically vibrating with fury. "You malicious, vindictive little girl. You just cost this family everything. Devin is gone. The trust fund is gone. We are going to lose the house, the cars, the business. You ruined our lives because you could not stand to see your sister succeed." Beatrice scrambled to her feet, clutching her pearl necklace. She joined the attack, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You are an absolute monster, Natalie. How could you do this to your own blood? We gave you life. We raised you. And you orchestrated the complete destruction of your own family in front of the entire city." I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic accusations wash over me. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I looked at the three of them, a shattered, pathetic portrait of greed and deception. "I did not ruin your lives," I said, my voice cutting through their hysterical screaming with absolute icy precision. "I did not force you to bounce rent checks. I did not force you to take out predatory loans from dangerous lenders. I certainly did not force Brittany to steal my medical records and fake a pregnancy. You made every single one of those choices entirely on your own. You dug your own graves and you expected me to jump into the dirt and bury my unborn child just to cover it up. I simply refused to be your collateral damage." Richard bared his teeth, stepping dangerously closer. "You think you are so smart?" he hissed, spitting the words at me. "You think you won, but you have no idea what you just unleashed. Without that trust, money, the creditors are going to tear us apart. The company will go under by the end of the month." I looked up at him and offered a slow, cold smile. "It will not take until the end of the month, Richard." I reached into the leather bag Daniel was holding and pulled out a thick red legal folder. It was the final piece of documentation we had prepared. I held it out toward my father. He stared at it, his eyes narrowing with a fresh wave of panic, but he refused to take it. I let it drop. It landed on the white carpet right next to Brittany's discarded bridal bouquet. "That is a copy of the federal audit that has been secretly conducted on your real estate firm over the last 6 months, I explained calmly. "While I was running my own forensic analysis of your accounts this week, I passed my findings directly to my husband. Daniel submitted them to the Financial Crimes Division. Your fraudulent shell companies, the hidden offshore accounts, the forged tax returns. It is all documented right there in that red folder." Richard stared at the folder as if it were an active explosive device. He began to hyperventilate his chest, heaving under his expensive suit jacket. "Daniel's office is seizing your company assets on Monday morning for tax evasion," I stated, delivering the final inescapable blow. "Every single bank account tied to your name is being legally frozen. The doors to your office building, the commercial property that I completely own, will be padlocked by federal agents before you even wake up. You will not have access to a single penny. You ruined your own lives, Richard. I just expedited the paperwork." Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing back into the wooden pew. Brittany wailed louder, curling into a fetal position on the altar steps. Richard dropped to his knees, entirely paralyzed by his own destruction. I did not stay to watch them mourn their empire of lies. I slipped my hand into Daniel's arm. We turned our backs on the screaming, wretched remnants of my family. We walked down the long, white-carpeted aisle together, our footsteps steady and echoing with the sound of pure, unadulterated victory. The dark, suffocating grip they had held over my life was finally broken. We pushed open the heavy oak doors of the cathedral and stepped out into the crisp, bright sunlight, leaving the darkness completely behind us. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the cathedral closed behind me, sealing away the toxic chapter of my past forever. I sat in a comfortable rocking chair in the sunlit nursery of our penthouse, looking down at the sleeping infant in my arms. My son was absolutely perfect. He was healthy, peaceful, and entirely oblivious to the massive storm he had inadvertently caused before he even took his first breath. Daniel walked into the room, handing me a warm cup of tea and gently kissing the top of my head. The quiet peace in our home was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute destruction that had taken place outside our walls. My phone buzzed silently on the side table. It was a message from my probate attorney. I had spoken to him earlier that morning to finalize the last piece of paperwork regarding my grandfather's estate. The text message contained a single highly anticipated sentence. "The legal transfer is complete. The moment my son was born, and his birth certificate was filed with the state of Delaware, the Generation Alpha Vanguard Trust officially unlocked. I was now the sole legal guardian and trustee of a $15.2 million estate. The money was securely transferred to heavily protected accounts entirely untouchable by the people who had tried so desperately to steal it." During my call with the attorney, he had given me a brief, highly satisfying update on the legal proceedings surrounding my estranged family. The federal audit I handed over completely dismantled my father's fraudulent empire. Within 48 hours of the ruined wedding, federal agents had padlocked the doors of his commercial office building. The government seized all of their corporate assets, freezing their bank accounts and liquidating their properties to pay off their massive tax debts. Their sprawling suburban mansion was foreclosed on by the bank a month later. Richard and Beatrice were currently living in a cheap, rundown roadside motel on the outskirts of New Jersey. They were strictly forbidden from leaving the state by a federal judge while they awaited their criminal trial for tax evasion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. They were facing up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of the wealthy facade they valued more than their own daughter. And then there was Brittany. Her perfect, highly curated life had violently collapsed. Devin had immediately severed all contact, leaving her with the massive cancellation bills for a $200,000 wedding reception that never happened. When the rumors of her fake pregnancy and forged medical documents leaked into her elite social circles, she became an instant pariah. The affluent friends she had spent years trying to impress completely blocked her phone number. Brands dropped her social media sponsorships overnight, not wanting to be associated with a clinically diagnosed fraud. Drowning in massive credit card debt, and with our parents completely unable to bail her out, the golden child was forced to face harsh reality. My lawyer casually mentioned that a junior associate at his firm had recently spotted Brittany working a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store in the suburbs. She was spending her days folding the exact same designer brands she used to boast about owning, completely ostracized by the high society she had sacrificed everything to join. Devin, on the other hand, handled the aftermath with the utmost class. A week after my son was born, a beautiful bouquet of blue hydrangeas arrived at our penthouse with a handwritten card from him and his mother, Gloria. They warmly congratulated us on the birth of our healthy baby and wished us a lifetime of happiness. They had moved on with their dignity, fully intact. I gently rocked my chair, listening to the soft breathing of my newborn son. For my entire life, my family had tried to convince me that I was the problem. They painted me as the bitter, jealous outcast while they built their grand illusions of wealth and superiority on a foundation of lies. But standing firm in the truth was all it took to tear their illusions down. I did not have to shout or scheme or seek violent revenge. I just had to step into the light and let their own deception catch fire. True power does not come from manipulating others. It comes from living authentically and refusing to be a pawn in someone else's toxic game. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, let me know how you found your strength in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving family betrayal. Remember, sometimes the greatest, sweetest revenge is simply living a beautiful, honest life, completely out of their reach. The harrowing story of Natalie and her family serves as a powerful masterclass in navigating extreme emotional and financial manipulation. Among the many takeaways from her journey, the most profound lesson is that the truth is the ultimate equalizer against toxic gaslighting. Dysfunctional families thrive in the shadows of deception. They rely heavily on guilt, theatrical emotional outbursts, and twisted narratives to maintain absolute control over their chosen scapegoats. In this story, Natalie's parents and sister expected her to crumble under the weight of their cruel demands, hoping she would react with vulnerable hysteria or blind submission. Instead, she taught us the unparalleled strength of clinical detachment. When dealing with pathological liars and manipulators, you do not need to scream to be heard, nor do you need to match their chaotic, venomous energy to win the battle. By treating their emotional warfare as a forensic audit, Natalie demonstrated that undeniable facts do not care about family ties. When confronted with irrefutable evidence like the forged ultrasound, the medical billing receipts, and the audio recordings of their bribery, the abuser's entire empire of lies simply collapsed under its own weight. This narrative reminds us that protecting your peace often means stepping back, removing your emotions from the equation, and letting the reality of an abuser's own actions destroy their false narratives. You are never legally or morally obligated to protect the dark secrets of people who are actively trying to destroy your life, even if those people happen to share your DNA. True power lies in holding your ground and letting the unvarnished truth do the fighting for you. If you are currently navigating a toxic relationship, please take a moment today to set one firm boundary and start documenting your truth before they try to rewrite it. The harrowing saga of Natalie and her family offers a masterclass in surviving extreme emotional and financial manipulation. Among the many takeaways from her journey, the most profound lesson is the absolute power of objective detachment in the face of emotional terrorism. Toxic individuals thrive in the murky waters of gaslighting and manufactured hysteria. In the story, Natalie's parents and sister relied on guilt theatrical breakdowns and social pressure to steal a $15 million trust fund. They expected Natalie to react emotionally, to cry, to scream, or to desperately defend herself against their absurd accusations. Manipulators count on these reactive defensive emotions to maintain control, exhaust their victims, and muddy the truth. Natalie, however, refused to play their game. Instead of fighting feelings with feelings, she fought lies with forensic evidence. By stepping back and treating her family's deception as a clinical audit, she completely neutralized their power. She used digital files, medical receipts, and audio recordings to dismantle a house of cards that emotions alone could never knock down. This approach teaches us that when confronting pathological liars, your greatest armor is documentation and calm, unshakable resolve. The truth backed by receipts and undeniable facts is a fortress that abusers cannot breach. You do not need to convince toxic people of their wrongdoing, nor do you need to match their venomous energy. You simply need to expose the objective reality to the light and let the architecture of their lies collapse under its own weight. Natalie's triumph proves that protecting your peace often means stepping aside and letting the perpetrator's own actions orchestrate their downfall. If you are currently navigating a toxic relationship, start documenting your truth today, set an unbreakable boundary, and refuse to let anyone else's manufactured chaos dictate your reality.